Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of our webinar series, Inside Immigration. Today, we're joined by panelists at Green and Spiegel, Evan Green and Emre Esensoy. Please feel free to ask any questions via the pop-up text bar on the right side of your screen, and we will do our very best to address them at the end. And if the panelists do not get to your question, you can contact them through the information provided on screen now. With that being said, I'll hand things over to our panelists.
Thanks, Danielle. Well, we are in the lazy, hazy days of summer, and it seems as if immigration has gone quiet for a lot over the last month. There hasn't been a lot of changes, but we're going to talk about a couple of issues which we think are relevant and need to be addressed. The first thing we're going to talk about is the changes to the express entry system and what we have seen so far. So typically, every 2 weeks, the government is doing a draw in the express entry pool of candidates. And in fact, according to the calendar, we would expect a draw perhaps later today. But the government announced in June, and actually in July, the beginning of July, held specific draws based upon specific occupations. So notwithstanding the fact that you may have 500 points, if you weren't in one of the specific occupations that was selected, you were not given an invitation to apply. So Emre, why don't you talk a little bit about the various occupations and what we've seen so far?
Yeah, sure. So like you said, earlier in the summer, Canada announced this kind of a change in the way that they are doing express entry draws. They're now kind of targeting certain categories based on skill sets, language ability, and so on. So they've identified a whole bunch of occupations. There are occupations in healthcare, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM for short. There are also occupations in the transport and agriculture sector. And sure enough, over the summer, we've started getting invitations to apply under some of those categories. So we've had a STEM draw, for example, early in July. It was interesting. The point cutoff for that was 486, which is actually pretty high. And that was kind of on par with the general draws. So it didn't make much sense there.
Much ado about nothing.
Exactly. But we've had draws in other categories. So we had 2 healthcare draws, and the scores were, significantly lower for those. It was 463, 476. Not sure if we're going to get another healthcare draw this year, because I think they've invited around 2,000 people under that. And we've also had draws for people who have strong French language skills. So those who scored highly enough on one of those approved French tests. And so we've had 3 draws for that, and that's actually pretty helpful, because the lowest score for those has been actually pretty low. Pretty low. So I think making sure to get a French language test done and getting that high score seems to be quite the advantage these days. Again, comparing it to people in STEM, we've had 1 draw with a fairly high score, whereas the French language one, we've had 3 draws with lower scores. So that seems to be what the government is targeting these days, or at least that's what they've done over the summer.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that this was a hugely touted that we're going to, we've known about the fact that they're going to have occupation-specific draws. I think they announced it last year at the end of the year. And when they finally introduced it, it wasn't that big a deal, because it was a couple points lower than the general draws. So it didn't really amount to anything. But where, as you said, where we have seen the numbers really come down is the French language applications and the targeting of those individuals. And don't forget, outside of Quebec, if you are a skilled worker and speak French, you can get a work permit fairly
Yeah.
easy, and it's not a requirement for the job. So there really is a push on francophonism outside the province of Quebec. And it's interesting when you balance this out with what's going on in Quebec. Although we weren't specifically, going to talk about it, in Quebec itself right now, the government has basically said, if you don't speak French, you are not getting immigration to the province of Quebec. And I think long run, it's a very short-sighted approach. It's going to affect them greatly, especially in the IT fields as we go forward, but certainly something to be considerate of. I mean, if you don't speak French and you are in the province of Quebec, you're going to have a really hard time getting immigration, for sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks who have, work experience in Quebec right now, but don't speak well enough French, they're probably going to have to kind of reassess their long-term permanent residence options outside of Quebec.
For sure.
We've also had one draw for the building trades category. Early in August, the score was fairly low for that as well. It's at,
what were the numbers? I think the numbers were really low too, though, right?
Yeah, they didn't invite a lot of people. But so the building trades ones, I think it's kind of similar to what they've been doing under the federal skilled trades category. They kind of do these draws once in a blue moon.
Right,
but
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, bottom line, stay tuned, right?
Exactly, yeah. And I think we probably have a lot of people who work in STEM listening to us. It should also, like, all of these will probably be paired later on in the year with everything else that they're doing under the tech talent strategy. So we're we're expecting more work permit categories and so on to be announced later in the year, and hopefully they'll be aligned with the care strategy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're starting to see kickback for the first time in a long time on immigration, specifically related to students and the effect on students on the housing industry, and the media picking that up and seeing where that goes. And it was interesting to see Sean Francis, who was the immigration minister up until recently, saying, oh, maybe we should introduce caps on study permits. So something to watch for. But it's the first time we've seen that in a while, where there's some scrutiny there on the effect on study permits and how that's affecting the markets in Canada and where we go from there. And we're seeing, in some of the press, what's going on with immigration, our housing crisis. It's interesting because always fine with the press. Okay, so now they're going off on this tangent with students, and students affect everything. Well, the students are also buying couches and buying cars and buying things here. So it affects the economies both ways. So you can make an argument any way you want. And typically that's how the press does it. So right now the pendulum is swinging. We've got too many students. So we'll see how that moves going forward. So we can certainly say it's been the summer of the forest fire. And what has the government done about that? Emre, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so this isn't, so earlier on in the summer, the government came up with some facilitative measures to help people who may have, immigration-wise, help them who they may have been affected by the wildfires. So if they've had any citizenship, immigration, or travel document that's been destroyed or lost or damaged, they can apply to get those replaced without a fee. Similarly, they can apply to extend or restore their status. So visitors, workers, students can apply free of charge for that as well. Especially, so the thing to note there is for people who need to restore their status, so their permits or status have expired, they might have more time to be able to do that. So the standard is to apply within 90 days of your status expiring. But depending on when it happened, they might have until September 30th to restore their status, regardless of when the 90-day period ends. But for folks who were expired after July 3rd, the standard 90-day period applies. So again, it's not really a new measure, but we've over the last week or so, especially in BC and out in the territories, we've had a lot of wildfires. A lot of people had to be displaced. So I think it's good to remember that it's still out there, and it's still, so the program is still open until September 30th. Similarly, there's a measure for people who were affected by the floods in Nova Scotia. Same kind of deal, except that program expires on November 30th. Yeah, so like I said, if you need to replace documents or extend your status, there's some help.
And then the big one that we, spent the whole month getting excited to announce was about the change in the IEC and how this is going to change all of immigration. So talk to us about that.
Everything. I like the IEC. So for those who are uninitiated, Canada has these arrangements with several countries. They're called, youth mobility arrangements or youth exchange, that allow young people from those countries that we have agreements with to come here and work and travel for 1 year, maybe 2 years, depending on the agreement. So we have that with a lot of EU countries, the UK, Japan, Australia, Taiwan, I think 30 odd countries, so not many. And we've been adding to them. So we've expanded the program with the UK, we've added Finland, and now we're adding Iceland.
There we go.
It's major news.
Major news.
Yeah. So yeah, if it's going to start in 2024, people who are from Iceland between the ages of 80 to 30 will get to come here and again work and travel for 12 months. They can participate again after the 12 months, probably in a different category. These are usually either open work permits or employer-specific work permits. So we'll get more details out for that. So again, it's not a major change, but whenever the IEC is expanded, I'm happy because it's very straightforward, and we don't have to do a lot of kind of onerous work like getting labor market impact assessments.
Yeah. I mean, the thing this year with the IEC that's been interesting is it's a quoted category. So each country has a quota, and it gets used up. Typically, we found, by October, most countries are done at the latest, and then they have to wait until January to get new numbers in a new fiscal year. This year's been sort of odd in that a lot of countries that we've had issues with in the past haven't filled up in the same way. They're still available. And it's the thing to remember is when you apply in the IEC and you get the approval, you don't have to come right away. They're typically good for a year. So you can put it in your pocket and then, come in January because everybody wants to come to Canada in January, right? So you can use it that way, but just you want to get a number. The one that got used up this year earlier than I was suspecting, because usually we have more availability, is the US one. So by, I think, the beginning of June, it was gone, which was a surprise, because in most years, that one was good until October, November anyway. But this year, it did get used up fairly quickly. So it's just another tool that we use, and availability, we go for it when it's available. And there's more availability this year for more nationalities.
Yeah, they also close the intake without much warning most of the time. Right. So it happens generally around October or November. But yeah, we maybe get like a week's warning. And
it's true.
Rush to get the application in. I think the thing to keep in mind for people who are using IEC work permits, again, the duration of the work permit depends on the agreements you have with the country. So with some countries it's 12 months, some countries it's 24 months, and some countries you can only participate once. So for example, if you can only do it once and you're only allowed 12 months, then And if you want to stay here longer, then you need another plan. And the 12 months is typically, that's all the time you get to get your Canadian work experience, to maybe put you on the PR track. So I think the bottom line is to kind of look to the future as well when you get your IAC work permit, and make sure how often you can participate and whether or not you can.
Yeah, long-term planning, right?
Long-term planning. Yeah.
So you got to get married really quickly. So get to work. 90-day fiance. 90-day fiance. So that's pretty everything we had on our schedule to talk about today. So thanks everybody for attending. Enjoy the last weekend of the summer. I always say the first day after Labor Day is New Year's Day. Everything starts on that day. So have a good last weekend, everybody. And thanks all for attending. Thanks, Emre.
Thank you, Evan. And thank you all for joining. Take care.
Over to you, Danielle.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Again, that's all the time we have. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, and special thanks to Evan and Emre for sharing their expert knowledge. If you'd like to discuss today's topics in more detail, you can reach out and book a consultation, and the details can be found on the screen now. I also encourage you all to sign up for our e-alerts and follow us on social media to keep up to date on the latest developments inside Canadian immigration. Thanks again, and see you at our next webinar.
Thank you.